Final Fantasy I, a blast from the past, and while it wasn't planned, it was the first of many and the granddaddy of one of the world's most well-known franchises. It's interesting going back and playing this game because there are things that are considered to be Final Fantasy-isms that just aren't present in this game. Things like chocobos, moogles, and summons, those come way later down the line. But you do see the foundation of various other themes being laid out. Things like crystals and the naming convention of items and spells, even the job system to an extent. And you even get an airship and you hear about a guy named Sid. Now, Final Fantasy I is a much more classic traditional RPG. The original released in 1987, later coming to America in the 1990s. And for those who don't know, the original Final Fantasy I was full of a lot of bugs and things didn't work, like the intelligence stats. A lot of weapons said they did things that didn't. So it was kind of a little bit of a buggy mess, even though it was so popular at the time. And there's been a lot of different versions of this game. And I recently snagged the Pixel Remastered version of this game. And this game really just fixes a lot of the things from the original game and makes it a better game overall, fixing the weapons, some of the weird stat issues, things that didn't work. It just makes it better overall. And aside from the visual differences, this version adds a lot of quality of life features that I feel just really enhance and make this experience much better overall. I won't go into each one specifically, but I will discuss some of them as we go through this. Now, as mentioned, Final Fantasy I feels more traditional. It feels a lot more like Dungeons & Dragons. It has a lot of classic race elements like elves, dwarves, and you face off against enemies like trolls and goblins, vampires, and even mummies that are just more commonly found in Western RPGs. And the bosses you face are things like the Lich and the Kraken. And where a highlight of most Final Fantasy games usually tends to be the characters and getting to know them and seeing what their character growth and arcs are throughout the story, this game is actually completely void of all those elements. There is a main story and a main plot that focuses around the legendary Warriors of Light. These characters, they have no true names or personality beyond the fact that they're just the Warriors of Light. Don't have set jobs. You can even do multiple of the same class if you really wanted, which is kind of similar to how some of the MMOs play out, which maybe we'll play those later, we'll see. Now, because of this, you can kind of self-insert and make up own elements around the characters, and it's something I did. So the first member of my group was Sir Lift-A-Lot. Now, usually I'd go with the Eggplant Knight just for theming reasons, but since I couldn't make the warrior purple, I decided not to do this. And this actually worked out pretty well because warriors in this game wear these sweet high heels that really just lift up their ham cakes. The second was a thief, Steely Dan, and you want to keep Steely Dan away from treasures, trinkets, and children because all of those things tend to disappear around him. And then my last two members I rounded out with the classic White Mage and Black Mage twins dubbed Salt and Pepper because this playing group just needed some seasoning. Now, the other two characters you can pick are Red Mage and Monk, but I didn't feel like hanging out with a homeless guy or a guy with a feathered fedora. And once you get your jolly crew together, you end up finding out the world is basically in a state of decay and slowly falling apart. The crystals are clouded and the elements of the earth are just falling apart. And there's a prophecy that 4 Warriors of Light appear holding faded crystals, and they're fated to save the world. Classic. Now, while you are destined to have a great purpose of saving the world, the game actually starts you out in a little bit of a prelude. You find out that the king's daughter, Princess Sarah, is actually missing, because apparently Steely Dan isn't the only guy around town with a van full of puppies and candy. Now, you quickly gear up in town buying things like weapons and magic, and the magic system in this game, again, works a little bit more like Dungeons & Dragons. You can equip 3 spells of each tier, and each tier has its own MP pool, and every spell cast costs 1 MP of that tier, which means that even if you run out of MP on tier 1, you can still use your tier 2 spells. Honestly, it's not a bad system, it's kind of classic. Once you properly gear up, you can respond to the Amber Alert set by the king and start heading north towards the Chaos Shrine, where you fight a lot of classic enemies like wolves and goblins, and you get used to the very simple turn-based combat system where you have the ability to attack, use magic, or use an item. You can also flee, which will become important to me later on in this story, but you can also defend, which I don't really see a reason why you would need to defend. Maybe I'm missing something here, but it was just a mechanic I never used throughout the entire game. With the squad eventually finding out that Sarah was kidnapped by a guy named after Christmas decorations. When you defeat him at the Chaos Shrine, he falls before you in front of the Black Crystal. And this Chaos Shrine and Black Crystal, while you don't know it at the time, are actually very important to the overall story. So good job, Prelude, for setting this up actually. Now, once you rescue Sarah and return to the king, the world's fastest bridge builders appear, and once this happens, you truly start your journey, kind of. It expands the map, and the game still is a little bit linear at this part, but you do get a text scroll signifying that the Warriors of Light are about to start their grand journey to save the lands from decaying. Now, you eventually run into a one-eyed witch who's missing her one eye, as well as finding a group of pirates ransacking a town. Now, I myself have actually been known to be a little bit of a pirate, as admittedly I have played Final Fantasy 1 before, but the original version. I had a friend who, at the time, I thought was a hacker because he had a bunch of Nintendo and Super Nintendo games on his computer, and I just thought that's what hackers did. But I was a kid, and kids are stupid. That's why guys named Garland and Steely Dan can kidnap us so easily. But this friend was able to acquire ROMs and emulate games on his PC, which is how I was first exposed to this game and some of the other Final Fantasies as well. And when you play on a ROM and an emulation, you get a lot of fun things like quick saves and speeding up the game and making things go a little faster. And these are actually features you get in the Pixel Remastered version. You're able to do quick saves kind of whenever you want, as long as it isn't in combat. And you can actually fast forward battles a little bit and kind of do auto fights. And you also get a run button, which is just super useful for just getting around a little bit quicker. Are these features kind of cheating? No, not these ones. There is another cheating feature, which we will talk about later on. They're just nice quality of life things that make things go on a little bit faster, which I always appreciate when a game can respect your time. And these older games tend to not do that. Now, after letting everyone know about my original pirate roots and robbing the salty crew of their ship, you break for the ocean, where you start having your yacht party as you make your way to Elfheim, the town of the elves. And here you find an elvish prince, where you find out the elvish prince has fallen ill and he's stuck in bed, just rotting away, doom scrolling on his phone. Surprisingly not to a drink that Steely Dan gave him, but to actually someone else named Astros. You also find the grave of a very familiar fallen hero here. As you progress forward a little bit more, you find a fallen castle with a king missing his crown. It always ultimately leads you to the first dungeon of the game, the Marsh Cave. And this first dungeon, the Marsh Cave, is actually quite large. And to be honest, if I wasn't playing the Pixel Remastered version here, I probably would have been doomed, because at this point, your party is still pretty weak. You don't really have access to a lot of healing spells, and your MP pool is actually quite low. So if you don't stock up on a lot of antidotes and potions at this point, you're probably going to have a bad time. And I actually ended up having a fun little run though due to my low supplies. I ended up defeating the boss, but the party was severely weakened at this point, and the only person left was poor little Pepper. And I just had to rely on her to try to run and sprint out of here as fast as we can, but I just kept dying and relying on fleas, and it just was a really rough time. But then I remembered there's a very powerful feature that this Pixel Remaster version has, and that is turning off encounters. Now, does this feel like cheating? Absolutely. But if it wasn't for this feature, I honestly would have just been stuck here. I could have never gotten out of the cycle of constantly dying, and I would have probably had to ultimately just restarted the game if it wasn't for this feature. So I appreciate that, and poor little Pepper was able to escape the dungeon narrowly with barely any health. And I figured on the way back to town, I can, see the king and give him his crown back, only to find out that the king ain't really no king, and he was actually the guy that roofied the poor little prince, Astros, and then he proceeded to lay a bully beat down on poor little Pepper. But once we got the Warriors of Light back together, defeated him, we were able to get a slightly damp eyeball from him, which, hey, the witch is missing an eye. And then you get some Narcan from her, so that way you can wake up the elf prince from his slumber. And the way these quest chains work, with you getting one item to allow you to get another item, is kind of the common theme a lot in this game and how the quest structure works. And it's nice, it's classic, it's very traditional, and it's fun. One thing just leads into another. You get little clues as you go on, as you talk to NPCs in town. It's just a very old school classic RPG feel, which makes sense because this is one of the most classic RPGs ever. Now, after you have your little run-in with the elves, you then move on to the town with the dwarves. And ultimately, the dwarves do what dwarves do, and they mine and blow stuff up for you. Eventually, you find a giant golem who's stealing Gandalf's line. You shall not pass! And then you move on to your first crystal temple, the Earth Temple. You beat up a vampire, get a gem, beat up the golem, then you get a staff and come back to the temple. I kind of didn't like this too much because of the backtracking involved. Like, you go halfway through the dungeon, leave, come back, do it again. But backtracking is kind of common in some of these old games, so it's annoying, sure, but it's not terrible by any means. Now, once you get the staff, you can go further in the dungeon and encounter your first main boss, the Lich. And once you defeat him, you open up the Earth Crystal, and the lands start recovering. And at this point, the game kind of stops being linear. You get much more freedom, and you can sort of go through the dungeons in any true order you want at this point. And most of these crystal dungeons and dungeons overall all have pretty decent themes to them and are all tied to the world in some way. The fire crystal area is inside a volcano, The wind crystal is in this giant windy tower. The water one is underwater that you need the help of the mermaids to go down and get to. There's an ice cave at one point. There's the cave that kind of brings in the sci-fi elements where you have to get a power core and it's got these robots defending it and you teleport around. There's just a lot of good thematic dungeons placed throughout this game. And as you're playing this game, you start seeing a lot of little things that you can tell influenced other games. Like when I was in the Earth dungeon with the bats flying around, it made me think of Pokemon Red, where you first go in that cave and there's Zubats all over. So you really see how this game kind of laid a foundation, really just kind of shaped the game industry as a whole overall. And as you continue to explore the map, you start getting other methods of traversal as well. You eventually get a canoe that helps you guide through the rivers, and ultimately get an airship that was created by a very familiarly named character to the Final Fantasy series. Now there is one thing you may have noticed, which I've kind of been trying to hide through the power of editing, and that is that the game launches and plays in this weird window mode. And it's kind of an odd little quirk of the Pixel Remaster version from what I found. And while settings like this kind of don't initially bother me, it did kind of get annoying over time, and I started trying to find a way to fix this issue to remedy it. And what I found was, thanks to a Reddit user, Scytherman96, he threw in this little thing under the launch properties in Steam. Actually completely removes the issue and doesn't use the pop-up window anymore. So if you do want to try this game, definitely would recommend doing that. Makes it look a little bit better, a little bit cleaner. But as the journey continues on, you eventually meet another reoccurring character in the form of Bahamut, the King of Dragons. And he basically makes you acquire a trinket, which weirdly enough is a rat tail. I don't know if there's some translation thing going on with that. Like why a rat tail would be a symbol of power is kind of a little bit beyond me. If you know why that is, let me know below. But once you get this rat tail and deliver it to Bahamut, the King of the Dragons, well, then your classes get upgraded. Now, what's the benefit of getting your classes upgraded? My warrior Sir Lift-A-Lot then became a knight instead, who was still rocking some sick heals and looking like a true queen. Can actually learn a couple of level white magic spells. Steely Dan, instead of just becoming a thief with a van, now becomes a thief of the night and turns into a ninja. Ninja gets access to a lot more weapons that it can use, one of them being one of the better swords in the game, but can also learn some low-level black mage spells. And then the white and black mages, Salt and Pepper, both become wizards instead of mages, and they ultimately just get higher rank of spells, things like Flare and all the Heliga spells and things like that. It just elevates those classes to the next level. And Salt apparently takes a karate class and gets this sweet stance. Yeah! And Pepper gets some crazy bedhead. The one thing that did kind of annoy me a little bit is as you go through some of these dungeons and progress, a lot of the gear is definitely just purely geared to warriors. I felt like my thief wasn't really getting all that much gear. Now granted, later on it got some of the better gear in the game, but it was just a little annoying. I wish the thief was getting a little more drip feed of items. It felt like the warrior was just constantly getting upgrades and new armor and new gear, and a little bit of a letdown there. Now at this point I didn't realize that I was not using combat to its full potential. What I didn't realize was I was only using magic through the magic menu, using MP for every spell. But what you can do, which I didn't realize, is that some items, if you check the description, have uses. And so when you go to items, you can actually use that item, and you don't even have to have it equipped. As long as your class can use it, it can be done. So then you can start casting spells like Fire and Blizzard and heals for free, and that just opens up the combat system way more and is super useful. And I feel like a big idiot for not realizing that before. I can't be the only one who didn't notice that or know that, I hope. But yeah, once I found that out, it actually made me like the combat system even more, and I realized there's a little more depth here than I previously thought, because for a while I was deliberately not using a lot of magic and just kind of spam attacking constantly because I didn't want to burn my MP. I wanted to save it for the final boss, but with this, get free spells. Free is always good. And with my upgraded classes, I was able to just round out the rest of the crystals and then continue on my path, getting all four, but all of their four coalesce into a single area once you awaken them, and you find out where it awakens is in the Chaos Shrine that you saw from the beginning. Now this is going to be a little bit of spoilers for the end of the game, but this game is older than I am, so I'm not really concerned about giving out spoilers for it. Find out that when you killed Garland in front of the Black Crystal, it sent him back in time. And when he goes back in time, he meets the 4 bosses that are clouding the crystals, and then he sends them back into the future and just creates this time warp of constant strife and crystals getting clouded and destroyed and everything. And so eventually you break this cycle of chaos and defeat him. I thought it was a pretty cool little story overall. I mean, it's obviously not deep, but I thought it was just fun. They threw in a little time warp story, and you kind of find out that your heroes are ultimately selfless because you stop this time loop, and then when they return, everything's just better. The lands are correct, everyone's happy, even Garland's a good guy now, and your heroes kind of remember their journey but just kind of fade off into obscurity, and they're the only ones who really remember their tale. And I don't know, it was just a nice little tight-knit closed loop story. It's a good time. And honestly, when I went into this game, I really wasn't expecting much. I was expecting it to be fun, I was expecting it to be fine, but I think I enjoyed it a little more than I thought I would. I think some of the quality of life things from the Pixel Remaster version definitely kind of helped and brought it up. As I mentioned, if I didn't have the no encounters thing for the marsh cave, I would have had to have restarted the game, and honestly, probably would have just dropped it then, because that kind of stuff, that's the one thing that can break me the most. That's actually the reason I never played through any of the Mass Effect games, is because I played for a few hours and died and lost like 3 hours of save data, and then I never wanted to touch it again. So that could have easily happened with this, but because I'm playing this Pixel Remastered version, it didn't happen. My biggest gripe about the Pixel Remastered version, other than having that weird window mode bug, which I found a workaround for, and does have a lot of fun features. Like I mentioned, you know, you can turn off encounters, which saved my life. You can speed things up a little bit. The auto battles is fun. You can even change the text from like classic to updated, which, I don't know, the updated version of the text just made me feel uncomfortable for some reason. And the music can even change from being the classic original music, which is ultimately what I ended up going with actually, to a more like hybridized version, a more modern, updated version of the music. Both were good. I just like the nostalgia of having the old music. To me, I just found that more enjoyable, and it kind of enhanced my experience a little bit more, but I could have easily went either way. The only thing that kind of does bug me about this Pixel Remastered version is that the price tag is pretty steep. Most of these games, when they aren't on sale, range from 12 to 18 bucks, and even when they're on sale, they're still like 10 to 15, which kind of ridiculous for games this old. I mean, like I said, the features are nice, but I don't know if they're that nice. And the bundle itself is also kind of pricey. I did get it on sale when it came up recently. It seems to do that about once a year. And then I was able to get like a coupon too as well. So I was kind of able to get this for about 50, which still is pretty pricey in my opinion. But so far it's so good. I don't know, really hit me with the nostalgia. Really reminded me of why this kind of grew into one of the better franchises and the most well-known franchises. So yeah, I'm probably gonna go through this Pixel Remaster, play through each one, and just give my thoughts on each of them. If you're interested in that, hit the buttons, let me know. I haven't played every single Final Fantasy yet. Yeah, it's gonna be fun going through and playing some of the ones that I miss out on. From there, if people want me to keep playing some of the other numbered Final Fantasies, I can keep doing that. Let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd be interested in. Yeah, Final Fantasy 1, I get why it's a classic. It's a good time. Wasn't expecting a lot out of it, even though I did play it before. As always, comment where I'm wrong. If you know what the rat tail signifies, let me know that too. But yeah, as always, drive fast, take chances. Later, nerds.